Conservatives oppose affirmative action because they argue that racial discrimination is wrong no matter what its motives are, and that everyone should be judged on the basis of merit alone. Liberals counter that this argument ignores the long history of systemic racism in the United States and its continuing impact today. In fact, the United States has a long history of intentionally shutting African Americans and other minorities out of governmental programs designed to help the poor. President Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932 promising to pull the nation out of the Great Depression with a package of legislation known as the New Deal. He and the Democratic Congress established many new governmental programs in the 1930s and 1940s, such as Social Security, intended to help the average citizen better themselves. But these programs were often designed in such a way as to limit their benefits to white people. Today, people of color comprise virtually all of the farm workers, housekeepers, and maids employed in the United States. This was also true in the 1930s, when Congress was considering the New Deal. At that time, more than 60% of the nation's African Americans were employed as either farm workers or housekeepers. In the South, that number was 75%. As a result, most of the New Deal legislation was written to explicitly exclude both farm workers and domestic workers. For example, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. This law established a federal minimum wage for the first time, and it also included provisions limiting the maximum number of hours an employee could be required to work. However, the law specifically excluded domestic workers and agriculture. Furthermore, it defined agriculture as broadly as possible, to include anyone who prepared, packaged, or stored any fruits or vegetables. Florida Representative James Wilcox gave a speech on the floor of the House in which he explained why the law excluded housekeepers and farm workers from the minimum wage provision. He said, "There is another matter of great importance in the South, and that is the problem of our Negro labor. There has always been a difference in the wage scale of white and colored labor. When we turn over to a federal bureau or board the power to fix wages, it will prescribe the same wage for the Negro that it prescribes for the white man. Now, such a plan might work in some sections of the United States, but it just will not work in the South. You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it." Social Security was perhaps the most important part of the New Deal, providing some measure of retirement security to elderly Americans. But like the Fair Labor Standards Act, Social Security excluded agricultural workers and domestic workers when it was passed. As a result, while 40% of whites were ineligible, a full 65% of African Americans were ineligible. And that number rose to 75% in the South. This exclusion remained until it was repealed in 1954. Similarly, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. This law allowed labor unions to organize and engage in collective bargaining with management to attempt to secure better wages and working conditions. When the bill was first introduced, it covered all workers. But the final version excluded farm workers and domestic workers. Furthermore, most New Deal programs were structured so that the federal government gave money to the states, but the states were then responsible for administering them and spending the money. Southern state governments were dominated by white racist politicians who used their power to limit payments to black citizens. And opponents of civil rights blocked all attempts to include anti-discrimination provisions in the New Deal programs. Black citizens suffered as a result. For example, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program is designed primarily to help children living in poverty. More black people live in poverty than white people do, and yet African Americans receive less money under this program than they deserved. In South Carolina, 48% of the children were black, but they represented only 29% of the children receiving welfare payments. Similar disparities existed across the South. Perhaps one of the cruelest exclusions involved the Selective Service Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill. After World War II, millions of veterans returned home and needed to find something to do with their lives. Congress passed the GI Bill to give veterans easier access to money that they could use on things like going back to college, buying a home, or starting a business. While the GI Bill absolutely had laudable aims, it was designed and structured in such a way as to limit its benefits among African Americans. First, due to discrimination, blacks were underrepresented in the military during World War II, and therefore a smaller percentage of black Americans were eligible for the GI Bill than white Americans in the first place. And there were other restrictions as well. In the 1940s, many universities still refused to admit black students. Recipients of the GI loans could only use them at universities that would accept them, meaning that African Americans were often shut out of an education due to a lack of space. Furthermore, the bill did allow recipients to use GI Bill money to enroll in vocational school. But the administration of this program was left up to the states. In many states, blacks were permitted only to enroll in training programs for fields that offered low wages. They were not permitted to enroll in programs preparing them for high-skill jobs, such as mechanics or electronics. And to make things worse, many states didn't regulate these vocational schools at all. They allowed many fraudulent training schools to open up with the specific purpose of stealing money from gullible black GI Bill recipients by providing them with no actual training. In 1947, the Urban League, a leading African American advocacy group, reported that although these courses have, in every case, been approved by the Department of Education in the respective states, it is doubtful if many of them meet minimum standards for this type of training. In the absence of other opportunities, the Negro may be easily exploited. Furthermore, veterans could obtain a GI loan, but these loans did not come from the government directly. Rather, they came from banks, and they were only backed by the government in case of default. As a result, black veterans had to convince a bank to give them a loan. But many banks simply would refuse to lend money to black customers, making the GI loan an impossible dream. The case in favor of affirmative action is compelling. Even among governmental programs designed to improve the plight of the poor, minorities are excluded and minimized. While the New Deal definitely did improve the financial situation of both white and black citizens, it benefited the former far more than the latter. When an African American member of the Roosevelt administration resigned in 1934, he said, "The way colored people have suffered under the New Deal is a disgrace that stinks to heaven." A black newspaper in Atlanta noted in 1935 that under the New Deal, the Negro was shown the same place assigned to him at the close of the Civil War, which had for 70 years sealed his illiteracy and poverty.